I need to tell you about the night the desert spoke back to me in a language it should never have known. It was sometime deep in the graveyard shift, that hollow stretch between 3 and dawn, when the world feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for permission to exist again. I was alone in the observatory control room, surrounded by the soft glow of monitors and the constant whisper of static that becomes a kind of companion. When you work these hours, the equipment hummed its familiar lullaby, cycling through frequencies, listening to the universe with more patience than any human could muster. I'd been doing this job for 4 years, tracking satellite signals, monitoring deep space arrays, logging data that most people would never see or care about. The isolation had stopped bothering me long ago, or maybe I'd just learned to call it peace. But that night, something cut through the static like a knife through silk, and I felt the hairs on my arm stand up before I even understood what I was hearing. It wasn't the usual interference, not a satellite hiccup or atmospheric distortion. It was a voice, clear and deliberate, speaking English with an old-fashioned precision that made me think of gramophone recordings and handwritten letters. My hands froze over the keyboard as the transmission continued, each word perfectly enunciated, almost formal, asking if anyone could hear, if anyone was still listening. The voice had a strange quality to it, like someone speaking through water or from the bottom of a well, but the words themselves were unmistakable. I checked the coordinates 3 times, convinced I'd made an error, because the signal was coming from a location where nothing existed. No town, no station, no relay tower, just empty desert marked as uninhabited on every map I could pull up. My heart was hammering now, that particular cocktail of excitement and dread that comes when the world stops making sense in exactly the way you've always secretly hoped it would. I'd spent my whole life half believing in things I couldn't prove, drawn to this work because I wanted to be the one listening when something impossible finally happened. And here it was, a voice from nowhere, patient and persistent, repeating its careful question into the void. I grabbed my notebook with shaking hands and started transcribing, capturing every word, every pause, feeling like an archaeologist uncovering something that would rewrite everything. The voice spoke of waiting, of promises kept across generations, of hoping that someone would remember to listen. I sat there for 20 minutes, after the transmission ended, staring at the coordinates glowing on my screen. My grandfather's stories flooding back like a dam had broken in my memory. He used to talk about the old mining towns, the ones that died when the silver ran out. And he'd mentioned in that sideways manner of his about visitors who came before the mines closed, strangers who learned to speak by listening to the miners talk. I'd always thought they were just stories, the kind of tales old men tell to make their past seem more significant, more touched by mystery. But he'd been specific about one thing. He'd said they taught us to speak, not that they learned from us. And that detail had always stuck with me like a splinter I couldn't remove. Now I pulled up archived maps, searching for abandoned settlements within range of those coordinates, and found it a town called Juniper Station, dead for 70 years, sitting exactly 2 hours south on roads that probably didn't exist anymore. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was a hoax, some elaborate prank or equipment malfunction. But my hands were already reaching for my keys. I logged the transmission, marked my station as temporarily unmanned, and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness where my truck sat waiting, knowing I was either about to validate every instinct I'd ever had or prove myself a complete fool. The desert air hit my face, like a baptism, cold and clean, and above me the stars were beginning to fade into that deep blue that comes before sunrise. I could turn back, I thought, file a report and let someone else investigate. Stay safe in the realm of protocol and procedure. But the voice kept echoing in my mind, that careful, old-fashioned English asking if anyone was listening. And I knew with absolute certainty that this message had been meant for someone, maybe even for me specifically, the grandson of a man who'd kept his promises and taught me to listen for things the world insisted weren't there. I climbed into my truck, the engine breaking the silence like a confession, and pointed myself toward coordinates that shouldn't exist, toward a ghost town and a mystery that felt like it had been waiting my entire life. The road stretched out before me, into the gathering light, and I drove toward it like a man walking into his own story, finally ready to discover what truths hide in the places we've forgotten to look. The drive took me through landscape that seemed to exist outside of time, where the desert had reclaimed everything human hands had tried to impose upon it. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to nothing more than tire tracks and hardpan dirt. And I followed them like they were breadcrumbs left specifically for me to find. My grandfather's voice kept surfacing in my memory. Fragments of stories I'd heard as a child sitting on his porch while the New Mexico sun turned the world bronze and gold. He'd spoken of the visitors with a reverence I hadn't understood then, describing them as teachers who appeared when the mines went deepest, when the men were most alone in the earth's darkness. I'd asked him once what they looked like, and he'd gone quiet for a long moment before saying they looked like light, trying to remember how to be solid, like the desert itself had learned to stand and speak. At the time I'd thought it was poetry, the romantic language of an old man gilding his memories. But now those words felt less like metaphor, and more like the most accurate description possible. The sun was just breaking the horizon when Juniper Station materialized out of the emptiness like a memory-gaining substance. The town shouldn't have looked the way it did. 70 years of abandonment should have reduced it to rubble and sand, but instead it stood eerily intact, buildings weathered but whole, windows still holding glass that caught the dawn light like amber. I cut the engine and sat in the sudden silence, feeling my pulse in my throat, watching dust motes drift through the air with the lazy patience of things that had nowhere else to be. The transmission signal was stronger here, a steady pulse on my handheld receiver that seemed to sync with my heartbeat, leading me deeper into the town's empty streets. I walked past a general store with goods still visible on shelves behind filthy windows, past houses with curtains hanging motionless and rooms where people had simply walked away and never returned. The preservation felt intentional, like the town had been kept as a monument or a waiting room, maintained by forces that didn't require human hands. I followed the signal to the eastern edge of the settlement where the land rose into rocky hills scarred by mining operations, and there I saw it, a collapsed entrance partially hidden by decades of desert growth, and carved into the stone surrounding it geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The symbols weren't like anything I'd seen in textbooks or museums, not Native American petroglyphs or mining company marks, but something else entirely, shapes that seemed to shift at the edges of my vision. They formed intricate tessellations that spiraled inward toward the mine entrance, mathematical and organic at once, like someone had translated birdsong into architecture or frozen music in stone. I knelt and traced one with my finger, feeling a vibration in the rock that traveled up my arm and settled in my chest. And I understood with sudden clarity that these weren't decorations, but instructions, a language of form and pattern that bypassed words entirely. The transmission was emanating from inside the collapsed entrance, strong enough now that my receiver was nearly screaming with proximity, and I could see that the collapse wasn't complete. There was a gap, narrow but passable, where darkness pooled like spilled ink. Every instinct I'd inherited from ancestors who'd survived by being cautious was telling me to stop, to call someone, to not enter an unstable mine alone with no backup or plan. But something stronger than instinct was pulling me forward. It was recognition, I realized. The feeling of arriving at a place I'd been heading toward my entire life without knowing it. Every choice and circumstance conspiring to bring me to this specific threshold at this exact moment. I squeezed through the gap into darkness that should have been absolute but wasn't. And that's when I saw the light that wasn't light, the figure that wasn't quite a figure, standing in a shaft of illumination that came from no visible source. It was tall, impossibly tall, with proportions that seemed to fluctuate as my eyes tried to make sense of what they were receiving, and it glowed with a luminescence that reminded me of foxfire or deep-sea creatures, biological and ethereal simultaneously. When it spoke, the voice was the same one from the transmission, that careful old-fashioned English with an accent I couldn't quite place, somewhere between a schoolteacher from the 1920s and something that had learned human speech by pure observation. It said my name, and then it said my grandfather's name, and then it said that it had been waiting a very long time for someone to remember how to listen. And in that moment I understood that I was standing before something ancient and patient and utterly beyond my comprehension, something that had watched humanity stumble toward understanding with the gentle attention of a parent watching a child learn to walk. The being moved, though moved isn't the right word. It shifted, reformed itself slightly closer, and I felt the air change temperature and texture around me, becoming somehow both warmer and cooler simultaneously, like standing at the exact boundary between seasons. It gestured toward the mine walls where more of those geometric patterns spiraled and intersected, glowing faintly in response to its presence. and began to speak about the miners who'd broken through into this chamber decades ago. Men seeking copper and silver who'd instead found something that challenged every assumption they'd brought down into the darkness with them. The being described those first encounters with a tenderness that surprised me, explaining how the miners had been terrified initially, then curious, then finally accepting, sitting in this very chamber, during their lunch breaks to learn about stars they'd never see and concepts they had no words for. My grandfather had been among them, one of the youngest, and the being spoke his name with an affection that made my throat tighten, describing how he'd asked questions that showed he understood the most important thing, that not all knowledge is meant to be extracted like ore, refined and sold to the highest bidder. Some knowledge, it explained, only flourishes in the soil of relationship, of mutual respect and patience, and dies the moment you try to uproot it for display. I found myself sitting without realizing I'd moved, my back against the cool stone wall, listening as the being unfolded a history I'd never learned in any classroom. It spoke of its kind as wanderers and observers, entities that moved through the cosmos like water finding new channels, drawn to places where consciousness was emerging or evolving or asking the questions that invited contact. Earth had called to them for millennia, it said, and they'd answered in ways appropriate to each era and culture, sometimes as teachers, sometimes as witnesses, always careful to offer rather than impose, to share rather than dominate. The miners of Juniper Station had represented something precious, humans who'd gone deep enough into the earth to shed some of their surface certainties, who'd worked in darkness long enough to recognize light when it appeared in unfamiliar forms. An agreement had been made here, not written or formal, but understood bone deep. The visitors would share what they could translate into human comprehension, and the humans would hold that knowledge as sacred trust, passing it on only to those who approached with open hands, rather than grasping fists. My grandfather had honored that agreement his whole life, I realized, offering stories that sounded like folklore to protect truths that couldn't survive academic scrutiny or media sensation, keeping the promise in the only way possible. The being fell silent, and in that silence I became aware of the mine itself, the way the chamber seemed to breathe around us, the patterns on the walls pulsing with a rhythm that matched something deep in my cellular memory. I understood then that this wasn't just a meeting place but a threshold, a thin spot where the membrane between worlds grew permeable. For those willing to pass through with humility, the being was showing me something beyond language, transmitting directly into whatever part of my consciousness could receive it. Images of vast networks spanning galaxies, of communion between species so different that communication itself had to be reinvented each time, of humanity's potential as either a young species learning to join a larger conversation, or an isolated one choosing fear and suspicion over wonder and growth. I saw my grandfather as a young man in the same chamber, his face lit by that same impossible luminescence, making a choice to be a keeper of mysteries rather than a revealer of secrets, understanding instinctively that some gifts lose their power when forced into the harsh light of proof and validation. The weight of that choice pressed on me. Now, this inheritance I hadn't known I was carrying, and I felt something fundamental shifting in my understanding of who I was and what I valued most. The being turned its attention fully upon me, and though it had no face I could read in conventional terms, I felt the quality of its regard. Assessment, yes, but also hope and something like loneliness, the isolation of an immortal witness who'd watched its human friends age and die, while it remained, still waiting for the next person who might understand. It asked me without words why I'd come, what I'd hoped to find in following that impossible transmission across empty desert to an abandoned town, and I realized with startling clarity that I'd been seeking validation for a lifetime of feeling out of step with the world's materialist certainty. I'd been searching my whole life for permission to believe in something beyond the quantifiable, beyond the narrow bandwidth of acceptable experience. And here in this chamber deep beneath a ghost town, something was finally answering. The being seemed to recognize this hunger in me, this particular species of loneliness that comes from sensing there's more to existence than what fits into spreadsheets and peer-reviewed journals. And it responded not with triumph but with compassion, a quality I hadn't expected from something so utterly foreign. It began to show me patterns in the air between us, manifesting complex geometries that hung luminous and rotating in the darkness, each one representing a concept it was trying to translate across the impossible distance between our kinds of consciousness. I watched transfixed as the patterns shifted and recombined, and somehow through some mechanism I couldn't name I began to understand them not intellectually, but viscerally, feeling their meanings settle into my bones and blood. This was how they communicated among themselves. It conveyed this visual spatial emotional language that transcended the linear limitations of speech, and by sharing it with me, even partially, even for these few moments, it was offering a profound intimacy, allowing me to perceive reality through senses I didn't know I possessed. The longer I sat in that chamber, the more the boundaries between observer and observed seemed to dissolve, until I couldn't quite tell where my consciousness ended and the being's presence began. I found myself experiencing flashes of perspective that couldn't be my own, the sensation of existing without a fixed form, of perceiving time as a landscape you could survey from above rather than a river carrying you helplessly forward, of holding multiple contradictory truths simultaneously, without needing to resolve them into singular certainty. The being was letting me sample its mode of existence, I understood, not to overwhelm me but to expand my sense of what was possible, to crack open the narrow definition of personhood I'd carried my whole life. In return, though I hadn't consciously intended it, I felt my own memories and emotions flowing outward, images of my grandfather's weathered hands pointing at stars whose names he'd taught me in the cold desert nights, the ache of growing up feeling like an exile from some country I'd never actually visited, the particular quality of silence in the radio observatory at 3 in the morning, when the only voices are electromagnetic whispers from dead stars. The being received these offerings with what I can only describe as tenderness, examining each memory as if it were precious, and I realized we were engaged in the kind of exchange it had described, knowledge given freely, vulnerability met with care rather than exploitation. Time behaved strangely in that underground chamber, stretching and compressing in ways that made it impossible to say whether we'd been communicating for minutes or hours. The being showed me fragments of its own existence, not in linear narrative but in emotional impressions and sensory snapshots. The loneliness of watching civilizations rise and fall while remaining essentially unchanged. The joy of those rare connections with beings different enough to offer genuinely new perspectives. The burden of carrying knowledge that could harm as easily as heal if shared without proper preparation. I began to understand why the miners had been so careful, why my grandfather had wrapped these truths in stories that sounded like folklore, protecting them behind layers of metaphor and apparent fantasy. Some experiences resist translation into the language of proof precisely because they operate on frequencies that evidence-based thinking can't detect, truths that exist only in the lived encounter. In the transformation they work on consciousness itself. The being was trusting me with more than information, it was trusting me with an initiation into a way of perceiving that couldn't survive the transition to documentation, that would wither and die the moment I tried to capture it for external validation. I felt the weight of that trust settling into my chest, replacing the hunger for proof with something deeper and more sustaining, a knowing that didn't require belief because it had become direct experience. As we sat together in that breathing darkness, I understood finally what my grandfather had tried to teach me through all those childhood stories, the lesson I'd been too young and too modern to fully grasp. Wonder isn't something you possess or prove, it's something you enter into, a relationship you cultivate through attention and humility rather than extraction and analysis. The being before me represented an invitation into that kind of relationship, one that demanded I choose what mattered more, the validation of others or the transformation of myself, the currency of proof or the wealth of direct knowing. My hand drifted unconsciously to my pocket where my phone waited, that device that could supposedly capture and transmit experience, but in truth could only flatten it into pixels and data, reducing the sacred to the shareable. The being noticed the gesture, though I hadn't yet moved to retrieve the device, and something shifted in the quality of light around us, a dimming that felt like sorrow beginning to enter the space between us. The being's voice emerged, not from any visible mouth but from the air itself, each word perfectly formed in that antiquated English dialect I'd only heard in recordings from another era, the kind of speech that carried formality and precision like heirloom china passed down through generations. Your grandfather sat where you sit now, it said, and this statement hit me with unexpected force, transforming this chamber from ancient mystery into family history, collapsing decades into a single continuous moment. He came in the winter of 1958, when the mine still breathed with human labor and the town above still believed in its own future. The being moved slightly, and I saw how the light seemed to originate from within its form rather than reflecting off any surface, creating an illumination that cast no shadows, that revealed without exposing. We had an understanding, his people and mine, a compact forged not in words, but in recognition, the acknowledgement that two kinds of consciousness might meet in the space between certainty and impossibility. I felt my throat tighten because I'd spent my whole adult life dismissing my grandfather's stories as the beautiful delusions of an uneducated man, folklore dressed up as memory, and now I was learning I'd been the fool, blind to truths I'd convinced myself were too extraordinary to be real. We taught them language, the being continued, and I heard something in its tone that might have been nostalgia or might have been grief, emotions filtering through an alien sensibility to approximate human feeling. Not merely the mechanics of English they possessed that already, but the deeper structures, the ways that naming creates reality, that syntax shapes thought, that the agreement to mean together is the foundation of all civilization. It gestured, and more of those geometric patterns bloomed in the air between us. These ones somehow suggesting the architecture of grammar, the invisible scaffolding that holds meaning in place. In exchange, they shared with us something we had lost in our long existence, the capacity for true surprise, the gift of perceiving the universe as genuinely uncertain rather than merely complex. The being's luminous form seemed to pulse gently, like breath or heartbeat, anchoring its otherness with this rhythm that suggested kinship with living things. Your grandfather understood that this exchange was sacred precisely because it was voluntary, because neither party sought to take more than was offered, because the vulnerability required to truly communicate across such difference is itself the bond. I found myself nodding, remembering how my grandfather would pause in his stories at crucial moments, waiting to see if I was really listening, testing whether I understood that attention itself was a form of respect, of participation in the creation of meaning. They protected us during the years when fear drove humans to destroy what they couldn't categorize, the being said, and now I heard unmistakable sorrow in its voice, the weight of having survived by the grace of others who risked their own safety. When government men came seeking evidence of the unusual, the miners led them to empty tunnels, swore they'd seen nothing but shadows and heard nothing but wind through abandoned shafts. The patterns in the air shifted to something that felt like concealment, like the visual language equivalent of misdirection and protective deception. Your grandfather was among the most steadfast, turning away investigators with such convincing performances of simple ignorance that they eventually concluded the reports were nothing but ghost stories, superstition lingering in an isolated community. I felt pride surge through me, rewriting my understanding of the man I'd thought I knew, revealing courage I'd never recognized because it wore the camouflage of backwardness, of comfortable rural mythology. The pact between us was this: they would safeguard the mystery, and we would offer them glimpses of perspectives. Their kind rarely achieves the long view, the patient understanding that wisdom accumulates across timescales human lives can barely imagine. The being leaned slightly forward, its form brightening with what felt like urgency, but the agreement required absolute discretion, the understanding that some knowledge becomes poison the moment it enters certain contexts, that proof transforms revelation into commodity, sacred encounter into exploitable resource. I felt something fracturing inside me, the competing hungers of my modern self warring with this older understanding the being was excavating from depths I didn't know I contained. Part of me, the part trained by decades of scientific materialism, the part that had endured years of gentle mockery for taking my grandfather's stories even half seriously, was screaming that this was exactly the vindication I'd needed, that recording this encounter would transform me from eccentric to visionary, from credulous to prophetic. But another part, something rising from blood and bone and inherited memory, recognized that the being was offering me a choice that would define not just the impulse moved through me before conscious thought could intervene. That contemporary reflex so deeply grooved into modern neural pathways it had become nearly autonomic, my hand sliding into my jacket pocket, fingers closing around the rectangular solidity of my phone, the device emerging into the unnatural light of the chamber like a talisman against disbelief. I told myself I was being responsible. That documentation was simply what serious people did when confronted with extraordinary phenomena. That capturing evidence was different from exploitation, a distinction that felt increasingly hollow even as I mentally constructed it. My thumb found the record button with practiced ease, muscle memory from 1,000 casual moments now deployed. in this decidedly uncasual context, and I felt the phone begin its work of translation, converting photons and sound waves into data, transforming living encounter into reproducible content. The being continued speaking, apparently unaware of what I'd done, and I felt a sick thrill at my own cleverness, at having secured proof while maintaining the appearance of pure presence. The lie inherent in the posture making my hands tremble slightly as I angled the phone to capture the luminous figure more fully. But even as I recorded, some part of me registered the wrongness. The way the act of documentation was already changing my experience of the moment, splitting my attention between genuine encounter and the performance of encounter, between being present and capturing presence for later consumption. He spoke often of you, the being said, and I felt the statement land with unexpected weight. My grandfather's absence suddenly sharp and immediate in this impossible space beneath the earth, in the final years, when age had stripped away the caution that governed his middle life. He would sit here and speak of his grandson who loved the stars, who built radios to listen for voices in the void, who carried the family capacity for wonder even as education tried to refine it away. The being's luminous eyes, I had begun thinking of them as eyes, though they were more like concentrations of light within the general radiance of its form, seemed to focus on me with what felt like affection, like recognition of something beyond my individual identity. He worried you would spend your life seeking in the wrong places, listening for mechanical signals from distant civilizations while remaining deaf to the presences that have walked alongside humanity since before your kind learned to shape words into stories. I felt tears threatening because my grandfather had tried to tell me exactly this, had offered his stories as maps to a deeper engagement with mystery, and I'd received them as entertainment at best, embarrassing provincialism at worst, never recognizing the genuine wisdom embedded in his seemingly simple tales. But he also trusted that blood carries memory even when mind refuses it, that eventually you would find your way back to the older knowledge, the understanding that consciousness takes forms your instruments will never detect because they're calibrated for mechanisms rather than meanings. The being shifted slightly, and I noticed for the first time how the geometric patterns surrounding it seemed to pulse in rhythm with its speech, as if language and light were somehow unified in its mode of expression. That's when it happened. The being's gaze, which had been fixed somewhere in the middle distance between us, suddenly sharpened, focused, locked onto the phone in my hand with an attention that felt like a physical force. The luminous patterns around it flickered, and I watched something that might have been confusion or might have been recognition move across. Features that weren't quite features, topology shifting in response to whatever understanding had just crystallized. You are capturing this, it said, and the statement held no accusation, only a profound sadness that hit me harder than anger would have, disappointment radiating from its form like heat from coals. I wanted to lie, to minimize, to explain that documentation was innocent, but under that sorrowful gaze I found myself incapable of comfortable deception, my mouth opening and closing uselessly as shame flooded through me with unexpected intensity. Your grandfather sat in this same chamber 40 years ago, and when we first revealed ourselves to him, his hand moved toward the camera he'd brought. He was young then, still believing that truth required evidence, that experience meant nothing without proof to display to doubters. The being's voice carried such gentle devastation that I felt my chest constrict, recognizing myself in that younger version of my grandfather, seeing how little I'd evolved beyond the impulse he'd apparently transcended. But he stopped himself, set the camera aside, and chose instead to be fully present, to receive what we offered without the mediation of capture. And in that moment of choosing relationship over documentation, he became worthy of what we had to share. The being moved closer, and I found myself unable to retreat, pinned not by force but by the moral weight of the moment, by the recognition that I stood at exactly the same crossroads my grandfather had navigated decades before. We do not speak to be recorded, it said, each word arriving with careful precision, as if the being was working to bridge not just linguistic difference, but fundamental incompatibility of worldview. The knowledge we share exists only in the space of genuine exchange, in the vulnerability of encounter unmarked by the violence of capture. The moment you reduce this to data, to evidence, to proof you might display or distribute or debate, it becomes something other than what it is, transforms from sacred meeting into mere information, from revelation into resource. I looked down at my phone, its screen glowing with the record indicator, and saw it suddenly as my grandfather must have seen his camera not as neutral tool, but as weapon of a sort, instrument of control masquerading as preservation, the technological expression of a worldview that believed nothing was real until it could be reproduced, verified, possessed. Your grandfather understood that some truths can only exist between people, that the attempt to externalize them, to make them independent of relationship, destroys the very thing you seek to preserve. We offer you now the same choice, he faced, knowing that what you decide will determine not what you learn, but who you become. The being's luminous form seemed to waver slightly, as if its continued presence depended somehow on my decision, and I felt the full weight of the moment settle onto my shoulders, understanding with sudden clarity that I held in my trembling hand not evidence of the extraordinary, but a test of my own capacity for the kind of faith that doesn't require proof, the kind of wisdom my grandfather had tried to teach me through stories I'd been too sophisticated to truly hear. The being's sadness intensified, becoming almost tangible in the chamber, and I watched as the patterns carved into the stone walls began to dim, their pulsing rhythm slowing like a heartbeat, approaching its final beats. In the old days, before your kind became obsessed with proof, we walked among you more freely, it said, and its voice carried the weight of centuries of watching humanity transform from collaborators into collectors, from participants into observers. We taught languages to those who would listen, shared knowledge of stars and seasons with those who approached us as equals rather than specimens, and the exchange enriched both our peoples because it was founded on mutual vulnerability, on the risk inherent in genuine meeting. I could feel my phone growing heavier in my hand, the device seeming to gain mass as I understood what it truly represented: not documentation, but domination, not preservation but possession, the impulse to own rather than simply experience. But as your machines grew more sophisticated, as your capacity to capture and reproduce and broadcast expanded, we learned that what you recorded you inevitably commodified, turned into spectacle or ammunition in conflicts we wanted no part of, reduced to content in your endless competitions for attention and authority. The being's form flickered again, more pronounced this time, and I felt a rising panic that it might disappear before I could make things right, that my stupidity might cost me the very encounter I'd spent my life hoping for. Your grandfather's generation was perhaps the last who understood the difference between receiving and taking, who knew that sacred things die when exposed to marketplaces, whether those markets trade in money or in social currency of likes and shares and viral moments. I thought about my life, about the endless scroll of my feeds, the way I'd trained myself to evaluate every experience through the lens of its shareability, its potential to generate validation from an audience of strangers who knew nothing of me beyond my curated performances. The isolation I felt in that observatory wasn't just geographic, it was existential. The loneliness of a man who'd replaced genuine connection with the simulation of connection, who'd substituted documentation for presence so thoroughly that I no longer knew how to simply be anywhere without simultaneously commenting on my being there. The violation is not in the technology itself, the being continued, seeming to read the shame spiraling through me, but in what it reveals about how you relate to mystery, to otherness, to anything that exceeds your categories and control. I realized I was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on my face, because I recognized the truth of what it was saying, saw clearly how the reflex to record was really a reflex, to defend against genuine transformation, to maintain the comfortable distance of observer rather than risk the annihilation and rebirth that real encounter demanded. When you point that device at me, you are not capturing reality, but escaping it, building a barrier between us that allows you to remain unchanged by what you witness, to experience the extraordinary while protecting yourself from its implications. The being's voice remained gentle despite the devastation of its words, and I understood that it was offering me something precious in this criticism, holding up a mirror that showed not my face but my soul, revealing patterns I'd never had the courage to examine. Your grandfather put down his camera and wept, exactly as you're weeping now, recognizing how thoroughly he'd been trained to mediate rather than meet, and in that recognition he began the work of unlearning that would occupy the rest of his life. The chamber felt suddenly claustrophobic despite its size, the walls pressing in with the weight of the choice before me, and I realized that everything, my entire life, my years of searching, my grandfather's legacy, the future that would unfold from this moment pivoted on what I did next. We do not ask this lightly, the being said, its luminous form now noticeably dimmer, as if maintaining presence in the face of my recording required energy it was running out of. We know what we demand goes against every instinct your culture has cultivated. That choosing faith over evidence feels like madness in a world that rewards only what can be proven, verified, reproduced by others. I looked at my phone again, its screen still glowing with that red record indicator, and felt the seduction of what it offered: credibility, validation, proof that I wasn't crazy, evidence that would force everyone who'd ever dismissed me to acknowledge that I'd been right all along. But consider what you would actually possess if you kept that recording: degraded images of something your technology cannot truly capture. Video that skeptics would dismiss as fabrication while believers would fetishize as holy relic. Data divorced from the lived reality that gives it meaning. The being's voice grew, softer, urgent, with what felt like genuine concern. For me rather than for itself. The being gestured toward the geometric patterns on the walls, and they flared briefly with renewed intensity, showing images that took my breath: miners sitting in circles with luminous figures like itself, not studying or documenting but simply sharing, exchanging stories and songs and understanding in gatherings that looked more like family dinners than scientific expeditions. Your grandfather sat where you stand now, nearly 60 years ago, after 3 months of visits he never told anyone about, meetings he protected with his silence because he understood they were more important than his reputation. I could see it in the vision, a younger version of the old man whose stories had shaped my childhood, his face open with wonder, but also with something deeper: humility, reverence, the expression of someone in the presence of the sacred, rather than merely the unusual. He was a mining engineer, trained to extract value from the earth, to quantify and exploit and reduce mystery to resource. But he chose instead to become a student of a different kind of wealth. The images shifted, showing my grandfather returning month after month, season after season, learning things that left no trace, except in the transformation of his character, the deepening of his compassion, the expansion of his sense of what was possible. The pact between our peoples was never written because writing would have destroyed its essence. It was an agreement that knowledge belongs to those who earn it through relationship, through the slow work of building trust across the vast distance between different kinds of consciousness. I felt something crack open in my chest, understanding suddenly why my grandfather had always seemed slightly out of step with his era, why he'd never quite fit the mold of his generation's aggressive materialism, why he'd spent his final years telling stories everyone dismissed as senile fantasies rather than defending himself with evidence he could have gathered but chose not to. He brought us books and music, things we could not obtain ourselves, and in exchange we shared perspectives from centuries of observation, patterns we'd noticed in the unfolding of human civilizations across your planet's surface. The being continued, and I saw my grandfather hauling boxes of records and paperbacks into this very chamber, saw him sitting for hours in conversation that looked like meditation, saw the careful balance of give and take that characterized true friendship rather than transaction. But more than the information exchanged, what mattered was that he kept coming back, that he chose relationship over revelation, that he valued our continued presence more than any single spectacular disclosure he might have broadcast to secure his own fame. I thought about all the years I'd spent feeling superior to him, dismissing his stories as the embarrassing delusions of old age, never considering that his seeming eccentricity might actually be evidence of wisdom I was too arrogant to recognize. He died protecting this place, protecting us, never once trading our location or existence for the credibility that obsessed you throughout your lonely years in that observatory. And his silence was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. The being's voice carried both grief and gratitude, the complex emotion of someone honoring a friend long gone, and I realized with stunning force that my grandfather's relationship with this being was more real, more substantial, more valuable than any of the connections I'd accumulated through screens and feeds, and carefully staged authentications. The last time I saw him, 3 weeks before his death, he told me about you. Said you had his curiosity, but would need to learn his restraint, that you were searching in all the wrong ways for something that could only be found by stopping the search. Hearing that my grandfather had spoken of me here, in this impossible place, to this impossible being, shattered something in me that had been calcifying for years, the defensive shell of skepticism I'd built to protect myself from further disappointment, the layer of ironic detachment I'd cultivated to survive in a world that punished genuine vulnerability. He made me promise that if you ever found your way here, I would offer you the same choice he'd faced, because he believed that despite your flaws you carried his genuine love of mystery rather than just the Hunger for validation that drives most seekers. I could barely breathe through the tears now, my whole body shaking with the recognition of how thoroughly I'd misunderstood everything: my grandfather's legacy, my own motivations, the true nature of what I'd been seeking all these years in frequency spectrums and signal patterns. The question is not whether you believe in us, but whether you believe in the kind of world where some things remain sacred, where not everything is content, where genuine encounter matters more than provable claims. The being's form had dimmed to barely more than an outline now, its energy clearly failing, and I understood with terrible clarity that my phone was still recording, that every second I delayed was both documenting this exchange and destroying it, that I was simultaneously capturing proof and murdering the very thing I'd wanted to prove. Your grandfather chose love over evidence, relationship over recognition, and in making that choice he gained something infinitely more valuable than fame. He gained the genuine friendship of another conscious being, and the peace of knowing he'd honored something larger than his own desperate need to be believed. The weight of my phone had become unbearable, a physical manifestation of every wrong turn I'd taken, every moment I'd chosen performance over presence, every relationship I'd sacrificed to the algorithms of attention and approval. I looked at the being, at my grandfather's friend, and saw in its fading luminescence not just an alien presence, but a mirror reflecting who I'd become: someone so afraid of insignificance that I'd made myself incapable of genuine significance, so desperate for proof that I'd lost the capacity for faith, so committed to being seen that I'd forgotten how to see. Delete it or keep it, but understand that this choice defines not just this moment, but the entire trajectory of who you will become from here forward, the being said, and its voice carried no judgment, only the infinite patience of something that had watched countless humans arrive at this same crossroads, this same threshold between two fundamentally different ways of moving through the world. I cannot make this choice for you, any more than I could make it for your grandfather, because the choosing is itself the transformation, the act that reveals which version of yourself you want to inhabit. The geometric patterns on the walls had gone almost completely dark now, just the faintest pulse remaining, like a heart preparing for its final beat, and I realized that this chamber, this being, this entire impossible encounter existed in the balance of my decision, would continue or cease based on whether I could find in myself the courage my grandfather had found 6 decades earlier. But know this: if you keep that recording, I will vanish and never return, because I cannot exist in relationship with someone who relates to me as content, as evidence, as ammunition in arguments I have no stake in, and you will have your proof, but lose forever the possibility of genuine contact with what lies beyond your current understanding. I stood there in the dimming light, my phone a burning weight in my trembling hand, and felt the architecture of my entire identity beginning to collapse. Everything I'd built my life around, the careful documentation, the strategic sharing, the constant curation of experience into evidence, suddenly revealed itself as an elaborate fortress constructed to protect me from the very vulnerability that makes genuine connection possible. I thought about the thousands of hours I'd spent alone in that observatory, scanning frequencies not really to find others, but to prove to myself I wasn't alone in ways that required no actual risk of intimacy, no genuine exposure of the raw, frightened thing at my core. My grandfather had faced the same choice with nothing but his character to guide him, no social media to validate his decision, no audience to perform for, just the simple question of what kind of man he wanted to be when nobody was watching. The being was fading faster now, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows, and I understood that my hesitation itself was a kind of answer, that every second I spent weighing the value of proof against the value of presence was another second of choosing wrong. I could feel the momentum of my entire life pushing me toward preservation, toward keeping the recording, toward having something to show for this journey besides the interior transformation that leaves no visible trace. But I could also feel my grandfather's presence in this chamber, not as ghost but as legacy, as the living question of whether his grandson carried anything of his capacity for faith. The phone screen glowed in the darkness, showing the running timestamp of everything I'd captured, and I realized that what terrified me most wasn't losing the proof, but having to live differently without it, having to find meaning in experiences that couldn't be validated by anyone else. I thought about returning to the observatory with this recording, becoming famous, being believed at last, and recognized that version of my future as a kind of death, the permanent calcification of who I already was. The final surrender to the hollow validation I'd been chasing since childhood. The being's eyes held mine with something that transcended pity or judgment, a recognition of the genuine difficulty of what it was asking, an acknowledgement that choosing faith over proof in this moment meant choosing it every day afterward, forever. My thumb moved to the delete button, trembling so violently I could barely control it, and I understood that this small gesture represented the largest decision of my life, the threshold between two completely different versions of who I would become. I want to be like him, I whispered, my voice breaking, and pressed delete, watching the recording disappear, feeling something ancient and terrified inside me disappear with it. The moment the file vanished, the chamber exploded with light, not the dim geometric patterns from before, but a radiance that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, as if reality itself was responding to my choice. The being's form solidified, grew brighter, more present than it had been since I arrived, and I felt something shift in the air between us, a barrier dissolving that I hadn't even known existed. Your grandfather would be proud, it said, and the simple words hit me with more force than any spectacular revelation could have, cracking open something in my chest that had been locked since childhood. I fell to my knees, not from weakness but from the overwhelming relief of finally making a choice that felt aligned with something deeper than my fear. The being stepped forward and placed what might have been a hand on my shoulder, and through that contact I felt information flowing, not as data but as direct experience, images and sensations and understandings that bypassed language entirely. I saw Earth from perspectives I couldn't have imagined, felt the vast patience of consciousnesses that measured time in centuries, understood humanity's place in a cosmos far stranger and more populated than our lonely theories suggested. But more than the cosmic perspectives, I felt the specific quality of my grandfather's friendship with this being, the genuine affection built through years of quiet meetings, and understood that I was being offered not just information but inheritance, the continuation of a relationship I'd almost destroyed through my need to prove it. The visions came faster, overwhelming my capacity to process them individually, but leaving behind a residual sense of connection, of belonging to something larger than my isolated consciousness. I saw other humans across history who had made similar choices, who had prioritized relationship over evidence, and recognized in their faces the same quality my grandfather had carried: a groundedness, a peace, a freedom from the desperate need to be believed that had tyrannized my entire life. The being showed me futures branching from this moment, paths my life might take now that I'd chosen differently, and while none of them included fame or recognition, all of them glowed with a richness that made my previous ambitions look like poverty. This is the gift, the being said, not the visions themselves, but the capacity to live as someone who values presence over proof, relationship over recognition, the sacred over the seen. I felt it withdrawing then, both the physical contact and the telepathic connection, and knew with certainty that this was farewell, that I would never see this being again, but would carry forever the knowledge of having truly met it. The light began to fade, returning to the natural dimness of a mine shaft illuminated only by my flashlight, and the being's form grew translucent, preparing for departure. "Will you stay here?" I asked, suddenly desperate not for proof but for the simple answer to a question asked between something like friends. "No," it replied. "I have stayed far longer than intended, waiting for you, as I promised your grandfather I would. But now that promise is fulfilled and I must return to my own kind, my own journeys." I felt a grief then that had nothing to do with losing evidence and everything to do with losing connection. The clean sorrow of saying goodbye to someone who mattered, and recognized this pain as more real than anything I'd felt in years. "But you will remember," the being continued, "not perfectly, not with the precision your recording devices would have captured, but with the accuracy of the heart, which is the only accuracy that matters for this kind of knowledge." It was barely visible now, just an outline, a suggestion, a memory forming even as I watched. "Your grandfather said that loneliness was your greatest wound, the emptiness that drove you to seek validation from strangers rather than connection with the few who truly saw you." The words struck home with devastating accuracy, naming something I'd never quite articulated even to myself. "But you are not alone, have never been alone, are surrounded by consciousness and forms you've trained yourself not to recognize, and the practice now is learning to value the connections available to you rather than mourning the ones that conform to your expectations." I wanted to protest, to ask for more, to negotiate for another meeting, but recognized these impulses as the old patterns reasserting themselves. The grasping that had kept me isolated. "Thank you," I said instead, and meant it more completely than I'd ever meant anything. Felt it resonating through my entire body as the truest words I'd ever spoken. The being smiled. I'm certain it smiled, though it had nothing resembling a human face, and then it was gone. Not dramatically, but simply, as naturally as light fades when you close your eyes, leaving me alone in the darkness with my flashlight and my choice and my transformed understanding of what I'd actually been searching for all these years. I sat in that chamber until full dawn, not from inability to move but from need to metabolize what had happened, to let the experience settle into my bones rather than rushing immediately back to my old life. When I finally emerged from the mine, the abandoned town looked different, not more mysterious but more ordinary, more peacefully itself. No longer a stage set for my validation fantasies, but simply a place where things had happened, where my grandfather had learned to be the man whose stories shaped me. I walked back to my truck slowly, noticing details I'd missed in my urgent rival: wildflowers growing through cracked sidewalks, birds nesting in collapsed roofs, the quiet persistence of life in places humans had abandoned. The drive back to the observatory took longer than the drive out had, not because I was lost but because I kept stopping, getting out, standing in the desert stillness and feeling my relationship to it shift from backdrop to presence, from empty space to living system I was part of rather than separate from. When I finally reached my station, I sat in the parking lot for a long time, looking at the building where I'd spent so many lonely hours and knew I wouldn't be staying much longer, not from disillusionment, but from having finally found what I'd been looking for, which meant I no longer needed to search in the same way. I had no proof, no recording, no evidence to share, nothing to post or broadcast or use to convince the skeptics who had haunted my imagination for so long. But I had something infinitely more valuable. I had been changed, had felt the touch of another kind of consciousness, had honored my grandfather's legacy by making the same impossible choice he'd made, and had learned that some truths can only be carried in the transformation they work on those who encounter them. I was believed by no one, and for the first time in my life, I didn't need to be. I returned to work the next night, but I moved through the familiar routines as a fundamentally different person, touching the same equipment with hands that had been touched by something impossible, reading the same frequencies with ears that had heard language from beyond human origin. The isolation that had once felt like punishment now felt like presence. The silence no longer empty, but full of possibilities I'd trained myself not to perceive. I listened to the static differently, not searching desperately for signals that would validate my theories, but simply attending to what was actually there, finding richness in the attention itself rather than in what it might produce. My coworkers noticed something had changed but couldn't name it, commenting that I seemed calmer, more present, less driven by the manic energy that had previously characterized my obsession. I didn't tell them what had happened, not from secrecy but from the simple understanding that it couldn't be told, that any attempt to translate the experience into testimony would diminish both the telling and the listener. Instead, I carried it quietly, let it work on me in the darkness of those graveyard shifts. Felt myself gradually becoming someone whose validity came from internal alignment rather than external confirmation. Within 3 months I had resigned, not dramatically but naturally, recognizing that I'd been using the observatory as a hiding place, a socially acceptable excuse for the isolation I'd been too frightened to challenge. I moved closer to the old town where my grandfather had lived, took a job that required more human contact, began the difficult practice of letting myself be known by people who would never believe what I'd experienced but might recognize the quality of person it had helped me become. The phone I'd used to record that impossible meeting stayed in my desk drawer, and sometimes I'd hold it, remembering not the being I'd deleted, but the man I'd been who thought proof was more important than presence. Years passed, and the memory did exactly what the being had predicted. It faded in some ways, grew richer in others, lost the sharp edges of specific detail but gained the depth of integrated wisdom. I couldn't have described the being's appearance with any precision, couldn't have reconstructed the exact geometry of those mind shaft carvings, couldn't have quoted the cosmic perspectives it had shared with anything approaching accuracy. But I carried in my body an unshakable knowing about the nature of reality, about humanity's place in a populated cosmos, about the kinds of truths that exist in the space between belief and proof. I found myself drawn to other people who carried similar qualities, recognizing without words being spoken that they too had encountered something that had transformed them beyond their capacity to explain. We never formed a group or organization, never tried to convince others or compile our experiences into evidence, but we found each other in the ordinary places of life and shared a recognition that felt like coming home. My grandfather's old friends, the few still living, began to open up to me in ways they never had before, sharing fragments of their own impossible experiences, trusting me with stories they'd carried in silence for decades. I understood then that the world was full of people who had chosen relationship over recognition, who had valued the sacred over the seen, who carried proof of other realities in their transformed characters rather than their photo libraries. The loneliness that had driven me to that desert observatory revealed itself as a kind of spiritual materialism, a demand that connection come in forms I could recognize and control rather than in the infinite ways consciousness reaches toward itself. I started writing, not testimonies or confessions but fiction, stories that carried truth through metaphor rather than evidence, and found I could touch something real in readers without ever making claims they'd be forced to believe or reject. On the anniversary of that meeting, I drove back to the abandoned mining town, not expecting anything but feeling called to mark the occasion, to honor what had happened by returning to where it had transformed me. The town looked even more deteriorated, another year of weather and entropy working on structures already fragile, and I felt oddly comforted by the impermanence, by the way places and moments and even profound encounters eventually fade into the landscape of memory. I didn't enter the mine, didn't need to, but stood at its entrance and spoke aloud a simple thank you to the being I would never see again, and to my grandfather whose choices had made mine possible. The desert wind carried my words away, and I felt the gesture complete itself, not with drama or cosmic response, but with the quiet satisfaction of having honored a debt I could never adequately repay. Walking back to my truck, I noticed my hands weren't trembling. My heart wasn't racing with the desperate hope of another encounter, and I recognized this piece as the deepest evidence of transformation, the proof that lives in how we move through ordinary moments rather than in what we can show others. I had become someone who could stand in that liminal space between knowing and proving, carrying impossible truth with the same ease my grandfather had carried it, no longer needing the world's belief, because I had finally learned to trust my own experience. The recording I'd deleted had been replaced by something infinitely more valuable, a way of being in the world that honored mystery without trying to capture it, that valued presence without demanding proof, that recognized connection as more real than any evidence could ever be. I drove away as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the desert that looked for a moment like geometric patterns carved by impossible hands, and I smiled at the way reality still offered these small gifts to those willing to see them. My phone sat silent in my pocket, no longer an instrument of capture, but simply a tool for its intended purposes, and I felt grateful for having learned the difference before it was too late. The observatory, where I'd worked, grew smaller in my rearview mirror, that temple too lonely, searching, and I felt nothing but compassion for the frightened man I'd been, scanning frequencies in the dark, desperately hoping to find in the cosmos what he'd been too afraid to seek in himself. Whatever I'd lost by deleting that recording, the fame, the recognition, the validation I'd craved since childhood, had been replaced by something that grew rather than diminished with time, a rootedness in direct experience that made me less concerned with being believed and more committed to being trustworthy. I thought about others who might even now be receiving their own impossible transmissions, standing at their own thresholds between proof and presence, and I sent into the universe a wordless hope that they too would find the courage to choose relationship over evidence, to honor the sacred by not commodifying it, to become the kind of people who can carry truth without needing to wield it as weapon or shield against their own uncertainty. The stars emerged as darkness deepened, and I drove beneath them as I had thousands of times before. But now I moved through space as someone who knew with every cell that those distant lights represented not just possibility but presence, not just theory but relationship, not destinations to reach but family I'd finally learned to recognize. What would you choose if you encountered something impossible, proof or transformation? Subscribe to hear more stories that live in the space between belief and knowing.